Patrol the night. It was endless. The quest to patrol the peril of the wastes, and the original reason why was long forgotten. The cities lay in ruins surrounded by a green, unholy mist that caused man and beast to suffocate, and their skin to burn. Usually, only one of their number was ever chosen to leave, and their job was to patrol the area surrounding the entrance to the bunker. Descended from orphans from the outside, taken in, and given a sacred duty to protect the masses, their lifespan was often short. A few rare survivors would live to become captains. The only companion they would take with them was one of the heavily armored horses. They too had to wear a gas mask to protect them from the toxic air. The horses were kept close to the entrance, under armed guard in a separate space, to protect them from the hungry masses. The saddlery was well worn and had to be repatched repeatedly. The most important part was the horse's helmet. Attached to it was a gas mask to allow it to breathe in the toxic air outside. With the straps adjusted, the heavy helmet attached to the horse's head, and the grim, heavy sound of breathing through a mask filled the air. Spiked horseshoes were strapped to their hooves to provide better protection and grip. A thick gel was ran through the horse's coat to protect it from the radiation outside. Before they left, they were injected with protective fluids to aid their survival chances. Chanting began, as a priest prayed with outstretched arms, blessing both man and beast with holy water. Clean water was rare, a sacred blessing. 2 riders stepped forward, knelt as they were sprayed with mist, and stood with their arms outstretched while their armor was put on them. Both of the riders looked the same, except one was taller, broader, and his left leg was stiff from an old injury. The captain's rank was marked by a black mark on his left shoulder, and had the assurance of someone who had done this many times before, while the youngest was more erratic, nervous. Each mounted their horses. They weren't supposed to name nor to bond with them. It was difficult not to when they spent their lives with them. Both their helmets were placed on their heads. They held their breaths while it was all connected. The knight jumped when the needles of the helmet pricked his skin, while the captain took them in stride. It took them a moment for their eyes to adjust to the change. A faint buzzing sound from the inside, and the eye sockets turned orange. Light came from the eyes.
"We're ready,"
the captain instructed. The hiss of the gas mask echoed throughout the concrete room. The door creaked open as 2 men spun the wheels to open them, and sprayed mist as they rode up to the sloped exit. The heavy doors closed and sealed behind them, while the next layer of doors opened. The outside air was finally exposed, and the sight of a long tunnel. The only light shone from their helmets, orange for the humans and yellow for the horses, lighting up the area around them. The pair rode their horses out of the bunker. Their armored hooves hit the ground, and they walked up into the main tunnel. Only the sound of hooves on the concrete floor echoed through the long tunnel. The first rider, the captain's horse, crushed a forsaken skull, and the bone fragments crumbled into dust. He didn't flinch, nor slow the pace down. They kept moving through the relatively deserted tunnel. The shadows of old, abandoned, metal structures lined the walls, with occasional light flickering on worn signs saying, "Danger," and "Trespassers will be killed." They made their way up, and both shielded their eyes from the bright light. They, like many others, only saw sunlight when they went on patrol. A hand on each rose up to tap buttons under the chin of their helmets to dim it until their eyes adjusted. They stopped in the middle of a massive area that had been cleared. The concrete jungle of ruined buildings marked the outline, with smaller wooden and mixed shelters that had long been abandoned. They stood side by side.
"Same as usual. Do not wander out too far. This is another basic patrol. Meet you here,"
the captain instructed, bored.
"Do we even try to look for survivors anymore?"
he questioned. The first scoffed, shook his head.
"We won't find any. Keep an eye out for trouble."
"What time are we going to meet back here?"
"When the sun is highest in the sky. There's no point of trying to stay out later."
"May you stand firm in the dark."
The knight inclined his head.
"And you."
The captain heard the farewell many times before. Both riders walked their horses in opposite directions, one left and one right. The eldest, the captain, with the most battle-worn armor, went down the left-hand path. There used to be many survivors that would come down this way. Here, there were the most recent signs of conflict. Still rotting corpses of humanoids, with bulging lumps from their eyes, ears and mouths. Those who had been exposed to the mist for too long, or had been infected through another method, drinking the water, eating tainted food, anything and everything could bring death. The captain leaned down from the saddle, stopped his horse, and examined the corpses closely. The glow of his helmet shone down on them. None of them moved, nor showed any signs of life. Finally satisfied, he leaned upward and continued his journey. The horse's armored hooves struck the ground. In the distance, there was movement, and a cloud of dust went up in the air. The horse's helmeted head tossed, with a warning beeping sound, and the captain drew his sword, ready to strike. There was a faint growling sound that came from under the rubble. The rumbling grew louder, and the horse tossed his head more violently this time. A twisted, gasping squeal came from the helmet. Some of the rumbling went quiet, but most of it only grew louder. Dust shifted, and pieces of concrete moved.
Easy, Zev.
How many horses had that name in the past? His mask hissed, and he turned his head to look in the horizon.
We're being watched.
Meanwhile, the younger knight set down his own path. The road was marked with wooden signs to alert other knights who had come before. Danger. Unclaimed land. Forsaken. These were recent, in red paint to be as eye-catching as possible. All warned the sole travelers of what could be found here. A deceased knight hung from what had once been a lamppost. His armor was pierced with long spikes, and a large, twisted metal spear driven through his helmet. It destroyed half of it, revealing a skull with an empty eye socket, a dread warning for what was to come. No one spoke of his name, no memorial, nothing. He tried to avoid looking at it. Occasionally, his hand would tremble. The first time he had traveled without company to protect him and warn him of the dangers. A long, low wailing sound came from one of the old subway tunnels. Her clothing and flesh had blended into one, eyes hollowed out. She was hairless and barely had any facial features. She stumbled out, crawling through the rubble, and her hands reached out to him. He waited until she was at his horse's hooves. He could have sworn she was crying, pleading with him, and for what he couldn't decipher. He drew his blade, rested it, and stared down at her, the red light from his helmet lighting up her face. He could have sworn there was something familiar about her, and during his moment of hesitation, he resisted, then heard the horse's muffled scream. She drove her fingers into the horse's neck, twisting and pulling on the skin. The rider struck down with sword, slicing her down the neck and shoulder, and her corpse fell to the ground. Her arms broke off at the elbows, the fingers remaining inside its shoulders. Unfortunately, the armor offered some level of protection. He didn't want to wait to see if there were any others waiting to strike. Still with the monstrous woman's hands inside the horse's shoulder, the knight urged his horse into a canter and rushed back to their meeting spot. He leaned down to try to pull the arms off, then wrapped his hand around her embedded fingertips and tried to pry them out. He reached the meeting spot and gasped in his armor. It was burning hot, with the sun at its peak in the sky. He felt hot and his body was sweaty. Again, his hands reached down to pry the fingers of the corpse, and finally, they dropped onto the ground. He stroked his horse's neck.
We'll get you patched up when we get back.
They would either die from heat exhaustion, or perish from whatever lurked around them. A deep moan from the right. A twisted being of flesh and metal appeared. Long tentacles sprang out, and it dragged itself along the rubble. A single yellow eye opened and stared at man and horse. It slowly pulled itself out of the rubble. It stood well above man and beast, nearly as large as the ruined bust nearby. It let out a screeching roar. The dead surrounding it came to life, moving their broken bodies completely under its spell, and lurched out from the shadows, each more twisted than the last. A few of them tried to resist, their jerky movements frantic, as old symbols around their necks tried to prevent the change, and they too fell under the control of the creature.
Oh, fuck.
He murmured, frozen in fear at the sight. The horse, still bleeding out, backed away. Before it found its courage, it arched its neck and struck the ground with its hoof, ready for combat. The strange woman creature they killed sprang back to life, trying to bite at the horse's legs, only to be struck down by the horse's hooves and trampled until her body could move no more. Fragments of skin and flesh clung around the hooves. As soon others began to get too close, those who had been killed, and reaching out, under the control of the large creature. The moaning monstrosity lifted its body up on its hind tentacles to reveal a mouth. No, an abyss, filled with a sharp hawk-like beak. A threat. He stuttered, shook his head in disbelief, and eyes wide in fright. A tentacle reached out and wrapped around his waist, lifting him up and out of the saddle. His sword dropped onto the ground loudly. The suckers pulled at his armor in all directions.
Join me. Join us. You belong to me.
The distorted voice loomed in his head. The only thing he could think of. He struggled, punched at the tentacle, but it was no use. He reached down for the knife in his boot, but he was shaken violently.
Join me. Join us. You belong to me. Become one with us. We are here for you. You belong to me.
He was pulled close to that large gaping eye. It sounded like he was being screamed at in his mind. He covered his ears, trying to keep the sound out, and closed his eyes inside the helmet. The rider heard and smelled the roar of fire. Two other knights were on heavily armored horses, bred to carry the increased armor and equipment. They carried heavy flamethrowers on their backs. One on either side attacked, letting out a spray of fire at the large tentacle creature that squirmed and dropped the rider on the ground. He landed with a loud crack. The tentacle creature tried to strike at the heavily armored horses. Soon the tentacle and body had charred marks, and a third came with a harpoon, firing at the creature, and with a massive burst of blue blood, it fell to the ground. The younger knight stood gawking, frozen in fear.
You fucking idiot.
The captain growled, irritated, and dragged the younger rider to safety, while the others continued their attack. It burned the flailing beast. Parts turned to ash and fell on the ground. It tried to escape before finally succumbing to the flames.
Join us. Stop. Join me. You're...
A final, high-pitched scream echoed around the empty city. It collapsed to the ground, dead. It didn't matter that some parts were cut off or burnt off. No time was wasted, and no meat was left behind. They began cutting the octohive into thick pieces, wasting nothing. An entire city of survivors could survive on the flesh from this for the better part of a year. The heavy knights, with the fuel now depleted, and strapped the larger pieces to their horses. Two walked to rest the horses. The younger knight awoke, blinking from the ground, and looked up. The captain refused to answer, his lips a tight line, and purposely looked away. He then pulled him up on his horse. The dead around them moaned, curled back in and hid during the blistering heat of the day, and without the octohive's call. He led the horses back, one carrying the meat on their back, and the other limped from the injury, and headed home. The metal bunker doors were still closed, locked shut, and they waited for the loudspeaker.
We need to renew our carvings. I came too close then.
He talked to himself, still shaken how close he had come to being taken over. They dismounted their horses, leading them inside, while the other knights did the same.
State your name and intention.
The nearly robotic voice rang out.
Returned from patrol, 8210B. We found a classified creature, 72K. We brought back meat and met with another patrol.
The captain pressed the communication button, clearly expecting the doors to open for them. There was no answer. The captain exhaled sharply within his helmet, and insisted, pressing the button more firmly this time.
We need to be let in.
Again. No answer. He clenched his fist and lowered his head when the metal doors suddenly sprang to life, creaking open. They entered, then realized the inner doors weren't in the process of opening up. Some of them went to remove their helmets, but he stopped them and shook his head. It was too late for the three.
We don't know why the door isn't opening.
Wait, what's going on? Do you think there is trouble?
I don't know.
The other three heavily armored knights approached the sensor, waved their arms to try to alert it, and bring attention to them. When nothing happened, they hit the walls, trying to find something that would work. Finally, the next set of doors opened, and they all strode through leading their horses, the mist spraying them. Bright, blinding lights surrounded them, and the three assisted each other in removing their helmets. The buckles and clasps removed, and they spat the breathing tube out and coughed. They rubbed tired, irritated eyes and talked among themselves about what they were going to do later. The captain yanked the younger knight by the arm, pulled him close, their helmets barely touching, and muttered,
We need to have a talk about what happened out there. I never want to see you take risks like that ever again.
He hissed, concerned.
Do you hear me?
Yes, sir. That won't happen again.
After medical, I expect you to.
The three heavily armored knights were the first to be affected. They coughed, clenched their stomach, and swayed on the spot and fell to their knees. Armor hit concrete. Their bodies rocked, clawing their faces, tearing at their own skin as bulges appeared on their arms, then moved up their neck. Endless feral screaming until their bodies went still, their hands tight around their throats. A blue liquid flowed from their eyes, ears and nose.
Sir?
The younger stepped back, terrified, pushing his horse away to protect him, and waited for instructions.
Don't open the gates. Code red. Code fucking red.
The captain screamed, his voice muffled inside his helmet, waving his hands to try to get people's attention. He stared, so stunned as he heard the voice for the first time.
Join us. Join us. Drink my blood and become one of us.
The protective carvings on his body now ineffective. The voice intruded his mind. Unable to shake it, he shook his head. It didn't make sense. All the other knights did was remove their helmets. He hadn't removed his yet.
Join us. Be one of us.
The wounded horse started to groan. Its neck had twisted shapes protruding from the wounds. It moved upward, twisting and turning until the gas mask helmet fell to the floor. It revealed a face of horror. Both eyes resembled the octohive's own, with blue blood leaking down from its eye sockets, muzzle and ears. It opened its mouth wide, ready to strike. Tentacles circled the horse's muzzle, and a hawk-like beak replaced the mouth, a small tentacle twisting out of the horse's flesh, in place of each of the wounds. Then it stood calmly.
No, it's true.
The captain remarked in disbelief, the sight weakening his mental defenses. He was spellbound, and couldn't help but reach out with a gloved hand. Zeph, his horse, and the three armored horses refused to stand still. Their prey instincts drove them to get to safety in the contained area, where they struggled to escape. The knight lifted his sword and cut down the infected horse's tentacles, causing it to scream in anger at him.
Join us. Join us and be free. You belong to me.
He then sliced down with his sword, cut the growth from the horse's neck, and the octohive abandoned its host, crawling on the floor to get to one of the humans on the ground, one sprawling tentacle at a time. It flailed, gripping the ground with its suckers, and roughly pulled on the horse's face, using its beak to saw through the metal. He looked into his horse's eye. A strange buzzing sound came from inside the horse. He held her in his arms. It was cruel to keep her alive.
I'm so sorry.
He murmured as he slit her throat, causing the blood to spray the floor. An unwilling mercy killing. Combined with the blue blood, it turned into a thick, purple-colored syrup of death. It clung to their boots and armor. The rider rushed over to his captain, shook him to try to bring back his focus, and smacked his helmet.
Stay with me. Stay with me.
Joy. The
knight shook him hard.
I'm okay. Keep your helmet on. It has been compromised. We need to get salvage files and supplies, then get to the last bunker.
Trapped. The captain gave the horses a look of pity for their position and clicked his tongue to encourage them to move backward toward the exit. They still wore the heavy gas masks to protect them. Together, they checked the eyes of their fallen comrades for any sign of them turning, for opening their mouths, checking the color of the saliva, and it was all normal.
Should we make sure they're dead?
No time.
He pressed the button, and his voice echoed throughout the facility.
Is anyone there? The Octohive is attacked. Are we to be disposed of?
Lifted his finger off to listen for a response, half expecting to be cleansed by fire. Silence. Only the creaking of pipes greeted them.
Has this bunker been overrun?
The question was left unanswered. Unfortunately, their swords were now blunt or damaged, yet they took them, preferring to have a weapon rather than none at all. The door slid open from the middle, leaving barely enough room for them to get through, and down the corridor there was a flickering light. With no time, they left the gore and the armored horses behind to go deep inside. They walked through after giving each other quizzical looks, drew their swords and entered. Every footstep made an echo sound throughout the walls. Their breathing increased, and they wandered through the entrance. There was no sign of anyone. Normally there would be people resting inside. There was water dripping from the burst pipes. The only light emitted came from their helmets that lit their way. Other than a flickering light far in the distance, they came to the first door that would open up at the atrium and stared inside. There was a dim lighting that lit up the room. It was completely deserted. It looked like it had been abandoned seconds previously, and the occupants would at some point return. Over the past 100 years, they tried to make this place a home, compared to the chaos of the world above. Rough boxes and old couches served as seating. There were plates and trays with food on top. The eldest knight reached down to test the temperature of the food. It was cold, but it hadn't gone rotten. No one ever refused food. Too costly and too valuable to waste. There had been strict rationing in the past.
We heard a voice earlier.
It could have been the pre-recorded lockdown recording. It is modeled on Professor Bright's voice.
There were kids' toys, old restitched teddy bears, and building blocks laying around. Nothing had been thrown, and nor were there any blood marks to indicate they came to any harm.
We'll check the dorms next. Get your weapon ready.
The two knights instinctively readied their swords.
It will also be worth going to the armory. We should have brought the electrified swords and crossbows with us.
We never needed them before.
The dorms were grouped together by families. Empty beds and chairs. Nothing thrown around as though there had been a panic. A few of the lights were on. Their footsteps echoed through the structure and became muffled when they walked over carpet rugs. Their lights moved over the room, finding nothing and moved to the next. The same. Deserted. They moved to a part with actual furniture, where the wealthy of the community rested, and the elder opened a wooden drawer. No personal effects were taken. Documents and items of wealth remained. Things that would have been looted or taken with them. The metal structure groaned, ached with the age of the building.
Next, we go to the armory.
The captain gestured. Lean close. I noticed a green light flashing, meaning the cameras in the room were activated. Theft was punishable by banishment or death.
Is anyone there?
There was a rattling sound, as though spoken through an old, damaged microphone.
You have made quite a lot of progress.
Then a snide giggle. The voice sounded like a child's, blended with the professor's recordings.
I wonder if you will find me.
It was cut abruptly before they got a chance to respond.
Who was that?
The child. I'm not sure. Perhaps the Octohive is trying something.
The pair looked at each other. Fortunately, it didn't sound like the Octohive. But what else could it have been? The voice was similar to the recording.
If it has access to the loudspeaker, then perhaps it is connected to the mainframe.
The younger's voice trailed off. They walked through the mess hall. There were trays of food and cups of water left behind. It was the same. Enough time had passed for the food to be cool but not rotten. Gruel and coarse pieces of bread sat. People worked back-breaking hours for their food, and it wouldn't have been left behind. Nothing was knocked over or spilled. It was all perfectly ordered. Next was the kitchen. The fires in the vent were cool, and were not used for some time. The food storage was all still intact. No looting or people grabbing what they could. The knights' stomachs growled, yet neither took any. They were only allowed to eat once granted permission. Disobedience was dealt with severely. They made their way down the hallway toward the armory. Normally it would be guarded, and the guard station was empty. Their weapons were also missing. He opened a metal box to reveal a well-worn keypad, paused, and tried to remember the correct code. He pushed a 7-digit code into it, and a loud beep, followed by an open mechanism, opened it up. He pulled the heavy metal door open, and it let out a loud creaking sound. Both men entered. Lining the walls were weapons for the facility, and a quick glance told them that nothing had been taken.
How many weapons should we take?
They looked at their swords. They'd been with them since they became knights, and respectfully placed them on a stand each. The elder knight, the captain, had already picked up a large electrical sword that buzzed. A purple electrical line zapped beneath the blade, and the younger picked up a long spear, then thought more on it, and took the crossbow instead.
Take a short sword too,
The captain said, strapping throwing knives at his belt, and they both swore off the guns. The order was forbidden to use them, and those that used guns in their order were treated with contempt. All the gun racks still had their guns in place. None of the guards had taken any to use. Now ready to go, they carried their weaponry and walked through the quiet facility. There was nothing that looked different from the norm.
When was the last time you were permitted down here? I remember needing to deliver something to the mainframe.
Never. This is the first time I've been down this far.
Occasionally the metal structure would creak and groan loudly. They were on edge, not used to the claustrophobic space they were now locked inside of. Each footstep echoed. The pair moved through the facility. The metal hallways were littered with items that looked like they'd been dropped from survivors' hands. No sign of blood nor damage. They came to the hydroponics section in a large metal room, with large tubes going from one side of the room to another. Around the walls and in the center of the room, there were metal bins with a thin layer of soil above. The plant and fungi grew under the UV light, and the buzz filled the room. Nutrient-rich water trickled down into the precious soil, long reused time and time again. Carp swam beneath in their murky water. The system offered renewal, and had been maintained for some time. Both the knights looked in at the flickering lights, and slowly entered where they had never been permitted to go in the past. Their boots made noise with every single step, and they made their way through until they reached the priest's quarters.
I remember being brought here from my life outside.
We're not supposed to speak about it.
The captain snapped, keeping his gaze focused on the lookout for any threats, and they moved further into the room.
I know, but...
They walked past the bronze statue of the founder of the Knights, in whose name they had taken their vows many long years ago, before they were sent out into the wilderness. The entrance was large, a light shining down on him, and ignored the sacrifices of the young men who were willing to die.
Do you remember coming here?
No.
He lied.
You have to remember. I came to the door with my parents. I think They found me somewhere and brought me here in hopes I'd be safe. I remember being taken in. I was examined by the priests and brought inside. My parents were forbidden to enter because they were faulty. I was brought under and...
Silence. I had a similar story.
He admitted.
Why were we chosen to go back outside and not the dwellers?
They walked into the main library. There were books with forgotten writing lining the shelves. Deserted, until they reached the large metal computers.
We were chosen for a divine purpose.
He answered, unwilling to believe it himself now. They pressed a button on a hologram machine, and a blue outline of a human woman appeared. Her smile was bright with white, intact teeth, and she looked at the pair. Good morning! What would you like to know, Professor? The captain waved his hand through the projection, confused and in awe at the technology, while the younger went straight to business.
How many children have been selected to become knights?
Professor, since the program began in 3102, there have been 372 children brought into the program.
And how many were from the outside?
All. No children from Bunker 7B were selected.
Why weren't they selected?
The children from the bunker are not able to be selected due to maintaining the correct population limit.
We were never allowed to speak with children from the inside.
What is done to the orphans? Show slides.
Slides activated. The knight flicks his hand. Images of young boys taken away from their parents at the entrance appear on the screen. Right when the world first fell, and a majority of the population were forced underground. They were experimented on, strapped to machines, and injected with a vivid green chemical.
I don't remember this. Do you?
The younger nodded his head, never looking away from the screen.
They wipe our minds, so we'd forget.
It showed the training. Taught to hate those from the outside. Repeatedly brainwashing and the repeat of phrases. The experimentation continued with injections, carving and burning symbols into their limbs, with no painkillers, and only chanting in the background. The memory slowly began to return to both of them.
We weren't orphans.
They watched the fate of the boy on the screen grow into a man. His training conducted on blurry slides made a scraping sound when replaced by a new one. Taken outside. Their first kills are their parents or other family members. Their faces forgotten and their pleas ignored. The final connection now lost. Another showed them being kept apart from the other members of the community, relying solely on their captains and priests for guidance. All ties for the knights are forbidden. Any outside influences are destroyed.
I can't believe this is happening.
With the tap of a few more buttons, it showed the boys with their eyes held apart with wire, green droplets placed in them. The boy's body was carved with symbols that subconsciously made them rest their hands on their own markings. The captain stared down at the slides, unwilling to look away or continuing to view additional information.
How were the children sourced?
Come on, let's go. It's heresy to question their teachings.
He tried to move past, wishing to protect himself. That question is classified. The knights are created to die.
To die, not defend.
The hologram is distorted with static. This time, her eye contact becomes intense, and staring directly at them. The knight's purpose is to serve, to die and be expendable. Neither of them wanted this answer.
What do the carvings mean? How do you get more knights?
He demanded sharply. All knights are information breach, illegal access. It changed to a deep, robotic voice instead, and flashed repeatedly.
So, this is where you've been hiding.
The hologram machine abruptly shut off, and both knights stood staring at it. They continued further into the labs, better lit and maintained than the dorms were. The professor's experiments were treated better than those in the often overcrowded dorms. The walls were a stark white, and the two knights with dried gore on their armor looked out of place. Here some of the horses were kept, only skinned and revealing bloody flesh. It was still alive, yet didn't move or act like it was in pain. It chewed casually. Before it looked at the two knights curiously, ears pricked forward, and let out a soft nicker of greeting. When they approached, they stroked its neck, and heard the beeping around its head. The captain looked at the exposed muscle tissue. A closer look revealed it was slowly healing itself with a new layer on top. The screen showed the metal skeleton of the horse, with a horse brain with additional program inside it. He looked down into the trough, and saw the horse chewing on pieces of dried bone. Of what, exactly, he wasn't sure. Now closer, he could see the bronze mechanical components. The cog slowly turned in its eye. They stared in disbelief. Horses had become rarer now, and yet, were they partially machines? A screen above its head showed a real horse brain, encased in metal and fragments of bone.
I knew they changed them, somehow.
They altered us too.
We'll come back for her.
The same voice they heard earlier echoed through the facility.
I see you found your way. I never would have expected either of you to make it this far.
The taunting voice rang out. Every so often it sounded robotic. The aroma of burnt flesh, skin, and hair hung in the air. They found the professor, the one who committed them to their sacred duty, and he had connected himself to the interface, wires attached to his brain, and his limbs unable to move. They had become one. He had taken control. One of his eyes glowed brightly, while the opposite was his normal human eye, bloodshot and deadly focused on them.
I tried to stop it. It is...
He winced, his body's tight, and he pulled against his bonds.
Don't let it get out. I'll try and stop them as long as I can. Please.
The professor screamed, the wires moving like living flesh and twisting in his skin.
Please. Stop them.
He went limp. His chest rose and fell to show he still lingered. Neither tried to physically check if he was okay. They went down into the belly of the bunker, the place none dared to tread. The large rats down there scurried with neon glowing eyes. Their squeaks loud, and only the sound of the electrical sword kept them away. The long dark hallways, lit up from the eye sockets of the knights' helmets, and they walked through into the unknown. Their boots made noise. Neither of them looked down to see what it was. Filth and rotted flesh fused together into a squirming mess of eyes and mouths gaped up at them. Soon, they were left down in the dark. They kept walking. One side of the tunnel was torn open and dug into the earth. A twisting, tight tunnel led the pair down into an open cavern, where they found the remains of the survivors. Their skinned corpses were positioned in a tight circle formation. Their bodies were tightly pressed to each other, and it was difficult to tell where one corpse started and another ended. In the center, a dais made of twisted black stone, and an altar made out of various items from the old world. The priest of the order already disemboweled and ribs cracked open. His head hung backward. 2 wide, empty eye sockets gazing back toward the 2 knights. And in the open crevices, a thick, swirling tentacle exited. The corpse sprang upward. The large eye in the center of its chest glared down at them. In such little time, it managed to seize control. Tentacles sprang from the inside, swirling in the remnants of the flesh, and turned with their suckers pointing at them, dried blood and pieces of gore dropping to the floor.
No.
He whispered, heartbroken, still hoping to find someone they knew. The knight froze on the spot, unable to move. He swayed and went unnoticed by the captain.
I see you have found me.
The near childlike voice rang out over the failing intercom, the static overtaken. And there was a burning smell, and the intercom let out a final scream. The professor gave his life in hope of saving them. Unfortunately, it was not effective.
Join us. It is time. You must join us, and we will be one.
The Octohive's voice boomed, repeating, drowning out all the other sounds. The knight could barely think with the pounding sound. His hands rested on either side of his helmet, and could do nothing to block it out. He dropped to his knees, the Octohive's speech taking over, and he didn't think he'd last much longer. The captain winced, protective markings burning his skin, and stepped forward to challenge the Octohive. He held his electrical sword. It glowed, ready to strike in the darkness. Their foe combined. The body of the priest hurried toward him, striking down with a large tentacle. He dodged it and struck down with his sword. It burned halfway through. The Octohive flailed around, struck upward, and brought down some metal railing. The captain rolled out of the way through the gore, sword still in hand, and cut down at another of the tentacles. It only went halfway, even though it barely made it through, and he lifted it again, striking down and half severing it, only to have a tentacle wrapped around him, squeezing him, and throwing him down onto the floor. The priest's body was cracking apart, barely clinging on. The knight watched, still unable to move, and found himself unable to breathe. The Octohive brought the captain close, glaring at him, and his ribs and spine were slowly being crushed, not before he took a knife and rammed it into its eye. The knight, crossbow drawn, fired an electrical bolt at it and caused it to become electrocuted. It jolted and spasmed before it finally fell on the ground, dead. The captain's broken body was released. He coughed blood inside his helmet.
I'm not going to make it.
He spoke through gritted teeth. His body rocked in pain. He reached up to the helmet, pressed the buttons, and it released, allowing him to breathe without it. Exhaled and finally felt free of the burden.
I don't care if the air is toxic. I don't want to die with that on me.
The knight nodded, tempted to remove his own, and wished they could have spoken more easily. Blood pooled beneath them, and it wouldn't take long until he would pass. He didn't know what to say to ease his captain's suffering.
Looks like you're going to get a promotion.
The captain's dry humor showed. He smiled with a mouthful of blood.
You might make it if we can drag you to the medical.
No.
He shook his head firmly.
No.
He started, more gentle this time. He pressed on a metal plate on his skull.
It is my time to go. You can live the life you were supposed to now. Don't repeat the mistakes of what happened here.
I promise.
You won't be alone.
He held the hand of his captain, whose body shook and the death rattle began. He had heard people die before, yet never so close. His friend finally passed away. Now the sole survivor of his order, he closed his friend's eyes with his hand and couldn't find the words to offer him in death. He dragged his commanding officer's body to the morgue, incinerating his friend's remains, and watching the fire slowly turn him into ash. He pressed the necessary buttons so the toxic air would escape the facility. The generators made loud noise throughout. Facility air restored. For the first time, he saw his reflection and removed his helmet to reveal a breathing tube. There was a disfiguring burn on his cheek. He could feel something move behind it. He had to tend to it now. Wasting no time, he took his knife and carved the tentacle out of his cheek. He pierced it, examining the wriggling mess before throwing it in the flames. He heated up the knife and cauterized the wound, the burning hurting his skin, and he rested his back against the wall, breathing heavily. He stripped off his clothing, carving more protective markings, 2 half circles with a line down the middle all over his skin.
You're not going to take me. I won't let you.
The blood trickled down his body and he stood, breathing heavily, closed his eyes and tried to feel if he was still infected. There was nothing. He suited back up to dispose of the dead without the risk of infection. He took each of the Octohive's mortal victims, dragging them down with him and placing them on a massive pile inside the mortuary, their facelessness blurred into one nameless soul. Not that he knew them from before. They were always kept separated. He tossed them into the flames, unwilling to allow their bodies to carry further disease, and only when the final one burnt, and now it truly felt empty, he decided what he was going to do. Now alone, he returned to the main building with all the supplies, yet nobody to guard and protect. He walked to the entrance, tending to the remaining horses and bringing them to the stables. The injuries were now clear on one of the horses. A metallic leg bone shone through, and to pull the octopus infection off, he had to rip the horse's skin upward.
Shh, easy boy.
He comforted it, then pulled the remaining pustules away and threw it into the fire. It screamed, burst, and finally turned to ash. He rested and stared at his expression in the mirror. He was aging faster than he had before, without the chemicals injected into him.
I can feel the change. The Octohive infected me.
Yes, it has. It won't take hold of you, but it might be able to infect the others.
Usually, he only heard the voice in his head, and now his lips moved, mimicking the words he heard in his mind.
What should I do?
He stood still.
Create and build the settlement. Protect them from afar, and choose exile before you turn.
He ran his fingertip over the purple, irritated skin on his cheek, and knew it would happen eventually.
The database AI can only do so much. It healed you as much as it can, and the predictability of infection is 10% for other humans. Do you want to be responsible?
It started to ache. He rubbed the discolored skin and knew what it meant.
It is slowing you down. You may never turn, but do you want to run the risk?
He lowered his head, avoiding looking at his reflection staring back at him. He started cleaning again, preparing for other people to come, and bumped against one of the computers, unsure what he had done. The screen flickered on. The professor appeared, wounded and hunched over, before he connected himself into the mainframe.
I have a gift for any survivors.
The hologram gave a bittersweet smile.
A serum. It works for those not infected yet, and the mechanical horses. If you've already been infected, it won't help you.
The tray opened to reveal a formula, with enough made for 100 residents. Hope for the future, one that he wouldn't be a part of. He cleaned the extended bunker alone and removed all the gore. It felt as though he was cleansing himself of all the sins he had committed, and sent out warnings to other remaining bunkers via radio signal. Soon he was no longer alone. People from the outside would come and join the re-established settlement. If there were those partially infected yet not controlled, what would he do? Each person was checked. If they were infected already, they were told to leave and make a new camp. The serum was given to those who decided to join him. He heard the gathered crowd before he saw them. People who had been on the road for some time, journeying in hope of somewhere to call their home. He saddled and took the last of the horses, treated with the serum, wearing the helmet with the gas mask, and the doors opened without the chanting that happened the first time. He leaned down to stroke his horse's neck.
Come on, Zeph. Time to go.
With a look toward the base, retaken, and would serve in the new order, he rode out to start to patrol the nearby area, leading any of the rare refugees back to the bunker to train as knights of the new order, never showing them his face. Once that was complete, he would expand outward and explore the wider parts of the city. On the rare occasions he would be inside.
I can't live like this. It is closed in.
He winced, scratched his arms, and noticed the discoloration. The infection had spread. While grade 1 mutations were okay, this was not.
Time for you to take the open road. For good.
He heard the voice and felt comforted in the truth. He was a danger to himself and to others. Perhaps in time he would morph completely.
It is time for you to lead them. Do not give in to cruelty or malice. I will return on occasion and lead more people here, yet this is no longer my home.
He addressed one of the boys grown to man in the safety of the bunker. His eyes were clear, healthy, and the blessing of technology was shared for all. The new leader listened, tears in his eyes, and nodded in hesitant agreement. His final preparations were made years in advance. Leaving occasionally, the unholy green air no longer burnt his skin. Yet the sun, even in the dawn, was too much to handle. Soon he was only able to travel at night, patrolling around the bunker and finding people to bring home. During the day he would hide. There were red clouds in the sky, dusk, and the only time when he would escape, he would be seen hundreds of years later, when the world outside had begun to heal, safe from the radiation and the sickness that plagued it. Now a myth, the nameless rider would patrol the night and keep humanity safe. Some said he was a ghost, others that he was no longer human, and it didn't matter. The patrols kept going. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.